Good evening, dear Dr. Rother, dear Professor Llanos, dear guests. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this joint book presentation and discussion, which is organized by the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung in Thuringia and the Willy Brandt School of Public Policy tonight. Bearing the name Willy Brandt School of Public Policy, I think it is mandatory to always look back at Willy Brandt and think about his personality. To learn more about the man who was so many things: a resistance activist against the Nazi regime, an advocate for freedom and democracy as mayor of West Berlin, a conciliator and peacemaker as federal chancellor of Germany, a role for which he is most admired by Erfurtians, and a visionary for one world as the president of the North-South Commission. We want to look back not only in admiration, but of course also critically. Thus, last year, we revived the tradition of guest lectures on Willy Brandt, with one by Scott Krause on Brandt's time as mayor of West Berlin during the Cold War. This year, we shift focus, decade and continent. It's a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Bernd Rother, who will take us to Latin America in the 1970s and 1980s and see which role, and based on which values, that's what I find most interesting, Willy Brandt, as the president of the Socialist International, played for different progressive movements on the continent.
Yeah, the guests, Professor Llanos and Dr. Rother, I would also like to welcome all of you here at the University in Erfurt. My name is Wolfgang Oefgen. I'm a member of the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation and I work for the office here at Thuringia, based in Erfurt. And we are very happy that tonight, as our first event this year of many following, we can unite those two big names of two big social democrats, Friedrich-Ebert and Willy Brandt, together on the stage, and furthermore look in the European winter a bit south to South America, to warmer and tonight at least more interesting regions. And I want to introduce you to Dr. Bernd Rother a little bit, and as an experienced scientist, there's a lot to say about his career and about his research, and I try to make long a bit short and just outline some of his steps. So he's the former CEO of the Chancellor Willy Brandt Foundation, against the name Willy Brandt. He studied at the TU Braunschweig, and he's an expert in social democracy movement worldwide, as we will hear tonight, and also tied to the local history of Braunschweig. So we have some international part and also some local part, and his research and publications about the workers' movement, the history of the SPD, the Social Democrat Party of Germany, and also the history of Spain and Portugal. And his publication, or his book, he wants to introduce us tonight is The Global Social Democracy, Willy Brandt and the Socialist International in Latin America. And it's not only a research about Willy Brandt, it's more like about his role in the global social movement, and which is not so well known in the broad public, but has some huge impacts on the politics in the 1970s and 80s, and maybe also today. So, and I would like to welcome Dr. Rother here on the stage to give us a small speech or lecture about his research and his book. And just one more information: as you can see, this event today will be recorded from the Willy Brandt School, but only the part of Dr. Rother and then the small discussion here in front. And the third part is that you also have the options of asking questions to our two participants here on the stage, but this part won't be recorded. So you don't need to be shy later to ask your questions. Nothing will be saved then. So, but now, Dr. Rother, please.
Thank you very much for the invitation, for the kind presentation, and I can add one thing which links me to the Ebert Foundation. I received a scholarship when I was a student, and thanks to the Ebert scholarship, I could also write my PhD thesis on the Socialist Party of Portugal, which was founded 50 years ago, and it was, I think, one of the first books on the Portuguese socialists, which was at least academic books on the Portuguese socialists, which was published in Germany in the 1980s, and this thanks to the Ebert Foundation. Well, and thanks, of course, to the Willy Brandt School for Public Policy for inviting me to give this lecture, which will last more or less 30 minutes, and try to give a short resume of this book, which is published in German, Sozialdemokratie Global. It's here at the University Library, as I was informed, and there's also the English translation, Global Social Democracy, and outside there is a voucher for a discount of 30% on the very high price for this edition, but in, I guess, a year and a half or so, or perhaps already in a year, there will be a paperback version of this hardcover version, which is more sought for libraries to last, which will not cost you $100 minus 30%, but I guess $20, $25, and until then you can, I don't know, does the library here in Erfurt have the English version? If not, you can ask via the interlibrary loan system in Germany, the English version. Well, let me start to try to give you an impression of what is at least partially the content of my book. I will start with a scene which is taken from the minutes of the Socialist International, or the papers of the Socialist International are stored at the International Institute for Social History in Amsterdam, so you can read all the details, all the confidential papers until the late 1980s, produced by the Socialist International in Amsterdam, which is a neutral place for all. They do have anarchist collections, they do have Marx Engels collections, they do have social democratic collections, wide range. On October 29, 1979, the parties of the Socialist International met in Lisbon for their regular biannual meeting. The focus was on an interim assessment of the Socialist International's work on Latin America. 3 years had passed since Willy Brandt had been elected president of the International for the first time, and had laid claim to expanding the international community of social democratic parties beyond the borders of Europe, to finding new partners in the Americas, in Africa, and in Asia. This had been particularly successful in Latin America. Carlos Andrés Pérez, who had ended his term as Venezuelan president 6 months earlier, participated in the meeting in Lisbon. Pérez was the leader of Venezuela's most important party at that time, Acción Democrática, which defined itself as social democratic. In Lisbon, Pérez took the floor to present his, I quote, points of view for shaping the Latin American work of the Socialist International in the medium term, end of quote. Carlos Andrés Pérez began, and I quote once again, but now the minutes of the meeting, he began by stating that European social democracy had missed many an opportunity in the past to actively shape its relations with like-minded friends outside Europe. He related his critical remarks in particular to the role of European social democracy with regard to developments in Southern Africa and with regard to the North-South problem, where European social democracy had not taken the leading role generally expected of it by its friends outside Europe. I repeat that he, the Venezuelan, criticized the European social democrats for not having taken the leading role generally expected of it by its friends outside Europe. But however, Paris highlighted the role of European social democrats vis-à-vis Latin America as extraordinarily positive. In essence, Paris asked for more European leadership. We're now talking about leadership, German leadership in Europe, perhaps German leadership beyond Europe, but in this case, Latin Americans asked for European leadership. Willy Brandt responded rejecting any interference by the European SI parties, Socialist International parties, in the internal affairs of the Latin American partners. That led to a short dispute. Paris said, "We wish the parties of European democratic socialism to intervene in Latin America," to intervene, he used this word. And Paris was supported by José Francisco Peña Gómez, Secretary General of the Dominican Republic's Partido Revolucionario Dominicano, and also a prominent figure in the Socialist International. Peña also called for greater SI involvement in Latin America. He, I quote him, made it clear that he felt that he was the voice of all Latin American members in inviting the SI president, Willy Brandt, to give concrete signs of a political offensive in the interest of democratic socialism in the remaining time until the next SI Congress in Latin America. This episode shows us that in the 1970s and 1980s, Latin American reformists were eager to learn from European social democratic experiences, pushed the Europeans to engage in Latin American affairs, but that the Europeans who had learned their lessons, or at least believed that they had learned their lessons in Latin America, and did not want to act once again in a neo-colonialistic and paternalistic way, were very reluctant patrons. But before I go deeper into this, let me make some remarks on the historical background. Before World War I, the Socialist and Social Democratic parties criticized imperialism and colonialism, but they did it from a European standpoint. Founded as an adversary to nationalism, as a herald of internationalism, it was hard for them to relate to national liberation movements. The adoption of Marxism by the European Social Democrats at this time did not make things easier, as Marx and Engels taught that the imperialist powers brought progress, for example, Great Britain to India, etc., by pushing the traditional societies into capitalism. In the interwar period between World War I and World War II, European social democrats hesitated to fight for rapid independence of their respective national colonies. The few members of the International from outside Europe mostly represented the emigrated Europe, a quote I took from Willy Brandt, the emigrated Europe. They were parties from countries such as Argentina, organizing the white workers who had left Italy, Spain, etc. After 1945, the European parties of democratic socialism did not act as a vanguard of decolonization. The British Labour movement accepted the independence of the Indian Empire in 1947, but left the African part of the empire untouched. The Dutch Labour Party supported the war against Indonesia's independence in 1946-47. The French socialists fought, when in government in the 1950s, against the Algerian liberation movement FLN and participated in the 1956 Anglo-French Suez Canal intervention. It was during the rule of the conservatives in France and Great Britain that Africa was decolonized. Until the late 1960s, the Socialist International regarded an unequivocal commitment to a multi-party democracy as the alignment with the United States-led bloc as indispensable for membership. But what did multi-party democracy have to do with real freedom of choice when oligarchs control the election process? When the puppet parties alternated in government without changing anything regarding illiteracy, poor health services, poverty, and social inequalities? Or to put it the other way around, how should the Socialist International evaluate the Cuban system, where political democracy was absent, but in terms of education and health, people lived much better than in most other Latin American countries? In the early 1970s, Cuba became a touchstone for European Latin American relations. Many left and center-left forces in Latin America admired Cuba for having successfully challenged the United States and for having introduced state-of-the-art social services. Even if they did not want to emulate Cuba's political system, in any conflict between the island and the United States, they stood side by side with Castro. Not surprisingly, the Socialist International was seen as an ally to the United States and had a bad reputation in the so-called Third World, including Latin America. The first European Social Democrats to distance themselves from the United States was the Swedish Party, then the renewed Dutch Labour Party, and the German SPD. In the second half of the 1960s, they started to reach out to liberation movements, but they did so outside the framework of the Socialist International. Under the impact of decolonization and the impact of the New Left, of the global 1968, and also of generational change inside the parties, both on the level of membership and of leadership, the Socialist International and most of its European member parties from the early 1970s on embraced anti-imperialism. Time and again, Latin American SI leaders stressed that until then, the Socialist International had been regarded as their countries as faithful allies to the United States. After the push, the coup d'etat against Chilean President Salvador Allende on 11th September 1973, which will be commemorated this year, 50 years ago, a further and lasting rapprochement came about between the Latin American and the European left. A decisive factor on the micro level was the generous reception of opponents to the Pinochet dictatorship in Chile by social democratic governed countries in Europe. In exile, the Chilean refugees and political refugees from other Latin American dictatorships got to observe social democratic policies in Europe more closely and soon dismantled their ideological reservations. On the macro level, the push demonstrated the necessity of a new thinking about socialist strategies for transforming societies. A narrow majority in elections, which had not even existed in Chile, and a stormy path of progress beaconed an all-too-great danger of radical reactions either by the military or the oligarchy or the USA or all together. Under the impression of the Chilean tragedy, the reformists in Latin America radicalized as the revolutionaries became more moderate. The radicalization of the reformers manifested itself in a transformed relation to revolutionary violence. Even the Portuguese socialist leader Mário Soares, whom the Latin American journalist Daniel Waxman-Schinker has still characterized in 1977 as an exponent of moderate counter-revolution in his country, Portugal. Even this Mário Soares backed the Nicaraguan guerrillas, the Sandinistas, in 1979. Expressly in the name of the Socialist International, he justified Soares, the Portuguese Mário Soares, justified the use of violence if, as in Nicaragua, it meant the toppling of a hated dictatorship. Nicaragua, as Soares said, fixed an important principle stand that without any doubt would set the relationship of the Socialist International with the progressive movements of Latin America, whether or not they claim to be democratic socialists. During Willy Brandt's presidency, the Socialist International's image in Latin America changed drastically and very quickly from that of a US vassal to an anti-imperialist force. So, reluctantly, and without being completely persuaded, even Cuban, that means communist, socialist observers, conceded to the policy change. A Cuban internal document from the Communist Party of Cuba from 1979 said, I quote, "We see a dual nature in the projection of social democracy in Latin America and the Caribbean. On the one hand, it does represent a permanent enemy of the essential objectives of the communists. But, on the other hand, it is obvious that certain political positions of social democracy can be used by the revolutionary and progressive forces of the continent at given junctures of the struggle." In short, during the 1970s, the European Social Democrats had undergone a fundamental change with regard to their view on liberation movements and revolutionary violence. As already mentioned, also on the Latin American side, things had changed. Searching for alternatives, the reformism of European social democracy came to the attention of the Latin American left. Since the end of the Second World War, the European reformist left had built a welfare state and used anti-cyclical economic policy according to the teachings of John Maynard Keynes. Sweden and other countries had shown that social political improvements did not have to be postponed to a distant or further, not so distant future after a successful economic ascent, as Latin American oligarchs and conservatives argued, but rather a possible parallel to economic success. Daniel Ulloa from Costa Rica's centre-left Partido Liberación Nacional declared in 1976, once again I quote, "The future of America, yes, the whole of humanity, could be seen in the Scandinavian countries, which were, as it is known, at this time governed by social democratic parties." Carlos Andrés Pérez's project of a great Venezuela, financed by the income of millions and millions from oil exports, should serve to prove that the social democratic way is also viable in Latin America, as he himself said. José Francisco Peña Gómez from the Dominican Republic stated in 1980 that social democrats and communists had elevated the living standard of workers in Europe to a level reserved for the middle class in Latin America. Now, reformist Latin American politicians wanted to learn from this example. Another reason for Latin American reformists to approach Europe's social democrats were the peaceful transitions from dictatorship to democracy in Portugal and a few years later in Spain in the middle of the 1970s. They seem to constitute a model that the Latin Americans could emulate. And the Latin Americans were also motivated to look to Europe because they needed allies on a global scale to weaken the US hegemony over the subcontinent. All these motives together brought European Social Democrats and Latin American reformists together, starting with the Caracas Conference in May 1976, where nearly 30 party leaders from Europe and Latin America gathered. It is important to emphasize that the initiative for the conference came from the Latin Americans, more precisely from Mexico's Partido Revolucionario Institucional. Really, it's called Partido Revolucionario Institucional, an institutionalized revolution, and Venezuela's Acción Democrática. On the European side, there had been growing interest within the social democratic parties towards Latin America in the early 1970s, triggered by the Chilean Unidad Popular experiment. And some discussions had taken place between Willy Brandt, the Austrian socialist leader Bruno Kreisky, and Swedish party leader and Prime Minister Olof Palme about a collaborative project, but until 1975-76, with no practical results. It was the Latin Americans who took the lead. Only in November 1976, with Willy Brandt being elected president of the Socialist International, the Caracas project was integrated in the framework of the Socialist International. One of Brandt's conditions to accept the new office was that the Socialist International should show programmatic flexibility when looking for new partners outside Europe. He dreamed of bringing together European social democrats and socialists with US Democrats, with India's Congress Party, with Latin American populist reformists like the Partido Revolucionario Institucional in Mexico and the Venezuelan Acción Democrática, and with the ruling African parties from Kenya, Senegal, Tanzania, and last but not least, with liberation movements as Angola's MPLA or the African National Congress of Nelson Mandela. Willy Brandt did not look for social democratic or socialist purity, but for forces with power that has the potential to ameliorate, to better the fate of the peoples. Additionally, what the Latin Americans aimed at when joining the Socialist International were two things. The larger countries and parties, like Mexico and Venezuela, were looking for allies to improve the terms of trade of the national economy vis-à-vis the industrialized countries. The smaller countries like El Salvador and Nicaragua, and not the governments there, but the left-wing organizations there, smaller countries and parties there, look for solidarity in their struggle to overcome oligarchic structures. Diversification of the foreign relations was among the goals of countries such as Mexico and Venezuela, which had profited since 1973 from sharply increased oil prices. Western Europe, especially the Social Democrats, were the initial addressees for such an approach. Support for the new world economic order, which the nations of the Third World were demanding, could most likely be expected from them. To improve the terms of trade for Latin American countries implied two aspects that were rarely mentioned in the contemporary discussions, but also in nowadays current economic studies. Firstly, this meant that Latin American countries strove for an increasing integration into the global economy, not for disintegration from the global economy, which was dominated, the global economy, by capitalist structures. And what perhaps could be changed was a geographic breakdown of the major export-import partners. That means to substitute partially the United States for the European Community, or nowadays European Union. Secondly, this strategy implied forgetting about South-South cooperation. Latin American politicians were not thinking of a South-South cooperation between the not completely industrialized nations, despite the existence of the movement of the non-allied nations as a group of 77. Taken together, for the South, this strategy meant more, not less, Eurocentrism. Whereas in the following years, efforts to synchronize economic policies of the ESI members in the North and the South were to no avail, the solidarity with local anti-oligarchic movements was much more successful. In the Dominican Republic, the European Socialist International Party's solidarity with their comrades was important to secure in 1978 the victory in the presidential elections against the long-time conservative office holder who tried to falsify the results. The most famous case of social democratic solidarity with the liberation movement in Latin America was Nicaragua. Because of its historical importance, I will have a deeper, short but a little bit deeper look into the Socialist International relations with Nicaragua, even if it was not about learning from Europe, but a story of tactical alliances and repeated misunderstandings on both sides. During Willy Brandt's term in office as president of the Socialist International, which stretched from 1976 to 1992, no other subject, no other country was so important as was Nicaragua, although the Socialist International even had no member party in Nicaragua. The Sandinistas only joined the International in 1996. What from 1977 on ensued was an initial phase of great hope for a democratic socialist model for the third world, followed by increasing disappointment that in the mid-1980s, for some SI members, led to a break with the Sandinistas. The majority of the Socialist International parties did not give up and tried in years of tirelessly conducted dialogues with Nicaragua and also with Cuba and the USA to keep the country on the democratic path. A signal should be sent out to assert that a third social democratic path between communism, Moscow-oriented, or Peking, Beijing-oriented communism and capitalism on the other hand, that a third path was possible in domestic and foreign policy terms. The credibility of the Western industrialized countries as a model of pluralistic democracy should be strengthened vis-à-vis third world social revolutionary and social reformist movements through its policy such as practiced by the Socialist International. Time and again, the Socialist International complains that the Sandinistas made it, especially the Nicaraguan liberation movement, the Sandinista movement, made it especially difficult for the Social Democrats to remain their friends. The Sandinistas tried for some years to establish a Marxist-Leninist one-party group. However, the International continued to be important because it remained an irreplaceable source of legitimacy domestically and externally for the Sandinistas. From 1985 onwards, aid to the revolutionary forces from the Soviet Union and Cuba dwindled rapidly, with Gorbachev as the head of the Communist Party of the Socialist Union, and his change also in foreign policy. Now, Nicaragua's government had to reach compromises with the opponents to survive. The opponents means the Contra-Revolucionarios, the Contras, sponsored by the United States. The Socialist International and its members became more important again, but no longer as an ally, rather as a mediator. Since the influence of the United States on the players on the ground also declined, players on the ground means also the other Central American governments, which were touched by the civil war which had started in Nicaragua in the 1980s. The governments of the region were able to act more autonomously. It was a member of the Socialist International Party, Costa Rica's Oscar Arias, whose plan brought the breakthrough to peace in Central America, and he was awarded with the Nobel Peace Prize for this. And in Nicaragua, the International played a major role in the Sandinistas holding fair elections and accepting their defeat in 1990. With its demand for compliance with the original goals of the Sandinista revolution, which had taken place in 1979, which were the original goals: mixed economy, political pluralism, and non-alignment, international non-alignment, the Socialist International forced the Sandinistas to rethink its revolutionary strategy. Whether this kind of soft power, of communicative influence in the recurring conversations, or whether the aggressive policies of the Reagan administration, which started an undeclared war against Nicaragua in the early 1980s by financing counter-revolutionary forces and mining Nicaraguan ports, in grain ports, ultimately played a greater role that the Sandinistas finally accepted pluralistic democracy cannot be determined. The SI, the Socialist International, tried to tame both the United States and the government of Nicaragua. But what is certain is that the strategy of the Socialist International was incomparably more peaceful. And the United States sponsored the Contra-war against the Sandinista government in Managua. 30,000 Nicaraguans died. A higher number in terms of overall population than there had been US casualties in the 1861-65 Civil War, World War I, World War II, Korean and Vietnam Wars combined. My conclusion: the rapid influx of new members after 1976 led to growing pains in the Socialist International. The opening up to non-European forces was so flexible, a few of the new partners proved to be a burden rather than an enrichment. Even in the everyday life of SI commissions and congresses, growing together proved to be a mutual challenge. Establishing the Latin American Committee of the Socialist International took years. The new economic program, which some Latin Americans spent a great deal of time preparing, did not, to the chagrin of its authors, change the government policy of Socialist International members in Europe. It took time to get to know each other sufficiently and to understand the different political cultures. Even as late as 1989, the election of a Chilean as Secretary General of the Socialist International met with skepticism among Europeans. Flexibility was the imperative of the Socialist International leadership's actions. The flexibility of the SI expansion coincided with Willy Brandt's repeated commitment not to export the model, neither with regard to the organization of the political realm nor to its economic composition, that means nationalization or not of the means of production. This was an important prerequisite for gaining new members outside Europe. The new ones, the Latin Americans, the Africans, the Asians, expected an equal dialogue in which they could contribute their own experience and ideas. At the same time, however, the Latin Americans repeatedly stated they wanted to learn from their European comrades, and they even wanted them, the Europeans, to interfere in Latin America. The European side did not want to state it that way, because it would have sounded like post-colonial paternalism. But if they were honest with themselves, then Brandt and his comrades in arms had to realize that the whole project of going beyond Europe only made sense if they offered their interference. The project was about more social democracy. This affects the national level as well as international relations in politics and economics. The renunciation of exporting models did not therefore mean abstinence from partisanship, but accepting very differing varieties of a socially just and democratic society. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Rother, for this very interesting insight in your book. I found it quite impressive how you brought all these big pages into 35 minutes, but I think we've all got a great idea now, and thus I would like to ask Professor Dr. Mariana Llanos here as well, who will discuss the book a bit in this thesis. First, I'm going to introduce her a bit. Mariana Llanos is a political scientist by training. He studied in Argentina and gained a doctorate of philosophy from the University of Oxford. She works on Latin American comparative institutions such as courts and the presidency. And she currently holds the joint professorship for democratic institutions in the Global South at the University of Erfurt and the German Institute for Global and Area Studies, the GIGA in Hamburg. At the GIGA, she's also head of the research program on accountability and participation. And at the Brandt School, she teaches courses such as democratization and autocratization, Global South trends. So we could think of no better discussant for Dr. Rother's book today, and I give the floor to you to discuss.
Thank you, thanks a lot. Oh, I have to speak with the microphone. Hello, everyone. Good evening. Dr. Rother, that was amazing. Thank you for the speech. It was a great summary of the book, as Lena said, and actually it doesn't make justice to the abundance of details and all the documentation and all the archive work and historical details that you present in your book. But so I recommend you to get the book and have a look at it. There are some chapters that are really amazing, like the Nicaraguan one that you were referring more in detail. But, well, my task is just to bring some of the points. I'm not sure I'm going to comment the book. I just going to tell you my impression, my reading of the book and the points that I made for myself. And first of all, I would like to call attention on the title, Global Social Democracy. I think I read it as an aspiration, the global part of it. I mean, it was Willy Brandt's idea, right, in the Socialist International to bring the social democracy to the world, to expand it, to make it global. But then we read in the subtitle, much smaller, Willy Brandt and the Socialist International in Latin America, so the global becomes more specific, and the persons become more prominent, the leadership becomes prominent, and a region becomes prominent. So there was this aspiration that social democracy would reach all the regions of the world outside Europe at the same level, we could say, but in the end it was Latin America that worked it out better in those years, we could say. I understood it like that. And I understood also that it made a total difference that there were the right people there, the leadership that was concerned with bringing this project from Latin America, these leaders from Latin America and from Europe working together. So the question for me could be if you could tell us, because there are many young people here, what was exactly the Socialist International? Because sometimes you write it was like a network of political leaders. It was a kind of forum for the discussion of ideas. it wasn't really an organization, right? Because it had a very small kind of headquarters in London, underfunded headquarters, and it happened that when the SPD and so the SPD and the FES, they make a difference when they come, and so there was an uneven kind of contribution to the International Socialists from the different parties as well. So how would you tell us what was the International Socialist before Willy Brandt and with Willy Brandt? Became an organization later, or remained like that, like a network?
Yeah, I would say it was a network. Historically, the Socialist International itself defines up until today as a successor to the first international founded by Karl Marx and others in 1864. So there's a long tradition, and I mentioned that the workers' movement, the socialist workers' movement, also Christian workers' movement, but the socialist workers' movement started in the 19th century as a herald for internationalism and criticizing nationalism, nation state, and proclaiming workers don't have a fatherland, but they have to cooperate beyond national borders. And things changed drastically between 1864, when Karl Marx and others founded the first international, and Willy Brandt in 1976 became president of the Socialist International. But throughout its history, and even with during the founding period in the 19th century, it was only a network or a working group of socialist, social democratic parties with a formal membership, but without no power for the direction for the president to decide on how to behave, how any of the member parties could behave, if they could or not enter a government, if they should adopt or not a certain policy. This is contrary to the concept of the Communist International, which well, they are also successful, but the real Communist International was dissolved in 1943 by Stalin. But the idea of the Communist International was that the central in Moscow could dictate the policy for every member party in every country, and under the risk of being expelled from the Communist International, these parties had to follow the directions that came from Moscow. So this was never the idea of the Socialist International. And with Willy Brandt, this character of being flexible, giving a platform for exchanging experiences, and in some cases discussing common strategies, which were not binding, but possibilities, became more important. And last point, before Willy Brandt and after Willy Brandt, the Socialist International, with the exception of the first international of Karl Marx in the 1860s-70s, the Socialist International never was an important international political actor.
And that's where Willy Brandt made the difference.
Yeah, Willy Brandt makes a difference, and this the generation of politicians. Maybe that numbers, the names that I could mention now don't sound for you, but those who lived then know these names. If I mention Carlos Andrés Pérez in Venezuela, or François Mitterrand in France, Felipe González, Mario Soares, Willy Brandt, Olof Palme, heavy weights, and a lucky combination of a generation of internationally thinking political leaders, which we don't have now.
Yeah, exactly. It was very interesting to read how you describe the International Socialist as a fossil in English, I think. Before, and how it had to adapt if it wanted to go global, right? And you use a lot those words of becoming flexible or elastic, but at some point overreaching on what were the principles or the goals of the Social Democrats to kind of embrace the new members, parties that were around the world, but somehow were different, without trying to impose an Eurocentric point of view, but trying to be open to other ways of interpreting or doing politics, right? And I noted what were those social democrats' principles. The first one was very important in economic policy, right? It was a mixture of private and public property to distinguish itself from the United States and from the Moscow, the Russian way of organizing the economic world. So, and what they proposed was not a drastic revolutionary change, but a kind of continuous reform to adopt a welfare state, kind of Keynes anti-cyclical policies, and so on. That was one thing. So the middle way in economics. Then regarding foreign policy, non-alignment in the West-East conflict. And then there was the holding democratic elections or multi-party elections where they say, okay, we don't want to kind of think that the rest of the world will adopt a parliamentary democracy as we have in Europe, so there will other ways of organizing. So that they were more or less the principles, but then they have to compromise. When they come to Latin America, things were moving, and were moving quite fast, right? So we have, well, I studied political science in the 80s, so I know this was my years as a student. So and it was the third way of democratization taking place, beginning in the south of Europe, so Portugal and Spain that you mention a lot in the book, and then coming to Latin America, Dominican Republic, 78, that you comment a lot, and the role of the International Socialists was very important there. But there were other things going on in the continent. Cuba was very important. There were other revolutionary liberation movements, and so the International Socialists had to adapt to kind of embrace these things. So it's at some point it overstretched a bit. What were of those three kind of principles the most overstretched in your opinion? Or the three of them were kind of...
The mostly broken was political democracy. The most overstretched was social change, so change for broad masses of the people. With the last, I mean that there were reflections by many of the SI leaders, including Willy Brandt, that there might be a situation in which a society was not yet ready for a full-fledged political democracy, Westminster style, etc. And first, you should have to introduce social reforms. That means fighting analphabetism, securing basic health service, etc., before the people have the possibility at the time to engage in politics. This is very problematic, even for social democratic standards, to separate or to say, might be that there are stages in the development of societies where a society is not still ready for political democracy. Others, and traditionally also social democrats, argued that from the first moment on, political democracy is a necessity, and we have to stress both at the same time, social equality and political democracy. But looking at Nicaragua, looking at El Salvador, but even looking at Portugal,
in 74, 75, up to Willy Brandt. You find in the archives reasonings, well, might we have to wait for democracy until the worst effects of poorness, of health problems are solved? And this brought the Socialist International into a very difficult situations when they accepted member parties which said, well, in 10 years we will hold elections, but up to the elections we will lay the ground for that the people will be educated to evaluate politics in a proper sense. And well, 10 years after, or another last example, there was quite a conflict between the Peruvian member party of the Socialist International and the European Social Democrats when in the early 1970s a military dictatorship took over the rule in Peru and introduced for the first time a land reform, agrarian reform, distributing great land ownerships for small peasants. But it was a dictatorship, it was a military dictatorship, a left-wing military dictatorship. The member party said it's unacceptable to work with these military dictators. But the Socialist International leadership and the Ebert Foundation decided better to have a military dictatorship which engages itself in favor of agrarian reform, land reform, than to have political leaders, even if they are member parties and social democrats, which who don't do nothing but discussing in parliament.
Yes, it was very difficult.
And this is very flexible. By the way, I owe this terms of flexibility and openness to Fernando Pedrosa, political scientist from Argentina, who wrote also a book on the Socialist International Latin America. His concept I found astonishingly perfect for describing this.
I think we have to understand this in the context of those years, because today you couldn't pass any exam, even of my BA course on democratization, if you would say that that's a definition of democracy, right? But with today's eyes, we know that what's the difference between electoral democracy and liberal democracy, for instance, but the standards, the basic standards of liberal democracy, that where you have a party that can lose elections are quite established. In those days, it was very much the discussion, and I remember at the university that difference between social democracy and political democracy, and even the chairs of the discussions among the professors, what you consider a democracy, was very much there. But now, I read that only in '89 could in your book, the Socialist International come to a definition of democracy that was very much the North European kind of definition of democracy, with, as we know, people have a choice between different parties, there is the possibility of a change of government, there are individual minority rights, and there is an independent judiciary system. This is a definition of a liberal democracy, but it was only 10 years or more than after Willy Brandt had arrived to be the chair of the Socialist International. And there is another thing, another kind of area of discussion which I found very interesting. I may say that, and then I open for you also to ask questions, which is was for me very interesting, that what you presented as well, that idea that the Socialist International didn't want to be Eurocentric, and Willy Brandt didn't want to present it as a model, but the Latin Americans were asking for more kind of leadership and ideas and we want you as a model and so on. So in the end, it strengthened that North-South kind of contact, even though it could have been the idea to have more South-South kind of contacts, right? There is an interesting passage in your book where you tell how the discussions were inside the meetings of the International, where all the members of the South were kind of giving opinions on problems of their own regions, but the Europeans were the only ones having opinions on the different regions. And there was a kind of a tacit consent that this was the way it was working, or it would work. So in the end, we didn't manage to get that, I don't know, maybe we did manage to get more Latin America and other regions outside Europe or not. It was more like strengthening that already existing connection with Latin America and Europe.
Yeah, there are many cases of dialectical developments. The Europeans wanted to overcome Eurocentrism, and what the Latin Americans wanted, well, I put it sharply, I put it simply, wanted to overcome US-centrism by establishing Eurocentrism. And this was surprising for me that there was never talk about establishing strong relationships between the SI members in Africa and Latin America. And what you mentioned, that the Latin Americans at the congresses and conferences of the Socialist International took the floor when it was about Latin American problems, and the Africans took the floor when it was African problems, etc. And the Europeans were the only ones who, for themselves, took the right, proclaimed the right to comment on all. And this was tacitly accepted by the others. No one disputed it. There was a situation in 1990, a Mexican representative new to the Socialist International that knows this convention, this tacit convention, and took the floor to comment on the Middle East, Israel, Palestine, and having in mind that in Mexico there were elaborated discussions about this, and why not present his point of view? And he asked the Latin American comrade, well, do you mind when I share my position with the conference? Well, no, yeah, well, if you think so. But afterwards you learned that he broke a rule which was never established, and no one had insisted on it. This was a self-imposed rule, which led also to situations that the Latin Americans were not present at the conference plenary discussions when Southern African problems were discussed, and vice versa. So this is a little bit rare when you start with an idea of well, there might be intercontinental solidarity, and there might be have been a situation that the Socialist International could have worked as a platform for not only bilateral relations, Europe, Latin America, Europe, Africa, Europe, Asia, but cross-continent relations. Was not the case, and it was partially due to traditional overcome European habits, but also you could say free choice by Latin Americans to African representatives to act this way and not break this rule. They could have broken this rule.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
I don't know why.
I don't know why. I'm just thinking also, maybe things do not change so quickly and just by determination, but we have to give time and see.
Yeah, it might be someone like Carlos Andrés Pérez, president of a very rich Venezuela at this time. They had billions at their hand. So he wanted to talk to powerful people via the SI network. So this helped him, this facilitated him to get in touch with European prime ministers, presidents, etc., which otherwise would have been difficult. So, but he had no special reason to improve the international position of Venezuela, to talk to ANC or MPLA Angola, before Angola found oil, leaders, etc. So it was, for them, it was also the Socialist International, a network that facilitated contacts with the powerful, and to add the US, the channels to the US with channels to the Europeans, which before had not existed.
Yeah, exactly. So, and this is the very interesting thing in the book, that there is a vision and there are these big ideas and there is the will, but then there is a reality. When you want to bring those ideas in place, then all these little problems come. So like the communication problems, the language you have to speak, or there were not so many communications as today. So how
to give you an example, you know Richard Kapuscinski, the Polish travel author, political author. He gives the information when there was a so-called football war, soccer war between El Salvador and Honduras in the early 1970s. In Honduras, there were two telegraph machines in the entire country. One was with the National Post Office, the other with the Presidential Palace. So how to communicate with the outside when you only can send letters subject to censorship, taking 4 weeks or more to get in touch. So you have to imagine these communication problems. And being member as a tiny party of El Salvador with 400 or 200 members, being part of the SI network, to know the phone number of Willy Brandt was an advantage compared to the president of El Salvador. You could contact Willy Brandt, you could see or François Mitterrand, or Felipe González, or Olof Palme, or important partners, the Democratic Party from the United States, contact them at an SI conference, which the president of your own country had great problems to do so. It's hard to imagine today with our communication possibilities.
And still the Social Democrats made a big difference over there. So I'm gonna open now. I just thinking the countries you mentioned a lot in the book: Venezuela, Nicaragua, El Salvador. You know what I mean?
Yeah, looking today, yeah.
If you think of them today, so what do we have to do today if we don't have the credibility of the political parties anymore? So we don't have the credibility in those leaders or the imagination in the leaders anymore. So, and we have a global problem too, which is a process of autocratization and not democratization. That was a nice term in those days. We are democratizing now. We are going the other way. So it's kind of difficult, right? So the favorite countries in your book.
Yeah. Well, I don't have a solution. I even don't. For the case of El Salvador, I can give an explanation, or kind of explanation, with where the civil war ended in the early 1990s, and directly afterwards, the Mara gangs were sent from Southern California, exported by Bill Clinton's anti-drug policy, back well, first for the parents it was back, for the children it was not back to El Salvador, but they were sent to El Salvador, and then this drug civil war in El Salvador started. But why in Nicaragua Daniel Ortega, the leader of the Sandinistas in the 1980s, already took this way, I don't know. Why Venezuela took this way, I can't explain. It's Cuando se jodió el Perú, Vargas Llosa's famous sentence.
Cuando se jodió el Perú.
Yeah.
So we can apply this to every country.
Yeah. When was it that it went to put it not so drastically, when it started to go wrong with Peru, with El Salvador, and not only when, this is in Conversaciones en el Catedral, conversations in the cathedral, which is not the church but the bar. It's called the cathedral. You should read it. But why? It's even more difficult to explain. Okay. But yeah, question.
So it's nice to be a historian in that case.
Yeah.
You know how to deal with today's problems. Thank you for inviting me to be here with you today, and thank you for the presentation.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you for your presence.
And read the book.